All right, we are going to talk a little bit about the revolution and its leaders. So start to talk about the second subunit of the Mexican Revolution. As we get into this, again, I just want to emphasize that there are generally, trends about what the IB is going to ask for, and that's not to say that I know or anything like that, but you frequently see similarities or at least sort of trends show up as we get into the questions that start to show up on a regular basis. And within the Mexican Revolution, some of the trends that I see are causes. So we just talked about that in our last unit, specifically what sort of factors led to causes of the revolution in general. But the other thing that I really see on a fairly regular basis is a discussion of questions that will deal directly with a leader, or even maybe comparing several leaders. And so, even if we look at last year's test, the two questions were, one about the Maximato, which is, about a period, but it's also specifically about a period that was created by a leader, in this case, Calles, and then the presidents that followed, who really were subject to Calles' goals and, left him with a whole lot of the power overall. And then the other question deals with Lázaro Cárdenas. Now, both of those periods come from Unit 3, the post-revolutionary state. But still, as we get into the leadership in this unit about the revolution and its leaders, and actually the midst of the revolution itself, it's certainly going to be worth being familiar with the leaders. And specifically in our folder for review, I added those sort of leader flashcards. And I think that those can be a useful tool as you consider and just try to make sure you're keeping straight who is in charge when, where are their alliances, and what are the major factors that drove them through this period. So for just as a general idea, again, those are things that I think should be emphasized as you're working your way through this. So again, I do have a link to the IDs and an ID Quizlet, but being familiar with these is going to be useful. You're going to need to be able to accurately differentiate between conventionalists and constitutionalists. Consider the importance of the Battle of Celaya for a group like the División del Norte. We'll kind of move through here, fairly quickly as well. So, the other thing that we get into in this is the Constitution of 1917. The Constitution of 1917 is also in my mind, a fairly common question, or at least we'll deal with that in some ways, or at least that's a very useful piece of information to be able to use to answer questions. If you're thinking about a question about to what extent the revolution was ultimately effective, well, looking at the Constitution of 1917, the implementation through the 1920s, or, maybe the increased implementation of those events in 1934 after the election of Lázaro Cárdenas, being able to talk about the goals of the Constitution is useful for helping people understand the causes, but also useful for helping people understand potentially the failures of the revolutionary period as well. Former paper 3 questions, again, compare, contrast Villa and Zapata, names of various leaders, Madero, Huerta, Carranza, Villa, Zapata. So again, this is very much focused on, do you know these leaders? Constitution of 1917 was more radical in theory than in practice. To what extent do you agree with this statement? Certainly. If you look at the anti-clerical laws that were never implemented except for briefly by Calles in the 1920s, if you look at the goals for education, discussion of equality between genders, a lot of that was really radical on paper but never fully implemented. Land reform as well. How important were economic grievances in causing the revolution that began in 1910, and to what extent were those grievances solved by the Constitution of 1917? Again, think about land reform. Think about the issues within the industrial economy. So trade unions and things as well. So that again gives you a chance to talk about the causes. What was the situation in 1910, and what aspects of the Constitution are effective at addressing that? Again, being familiar with some of these documents. Some more important than others, but being able to differentiate between these people as well is going to be useful for us. Again, one of the differences that we've talked about, and again, if you're asked to compare leaders, I think it's interesting to compare Madero to others, maybe like Zapata or something, because when we think about the conditions, the causes of the revolution, the causes differ for whichever of these revolutionary leaders we're talking about. And in the case of somebody like Madero, the causes really are limits of political, limits of political involvement. Madero was a hacendado. He was very wealthy, was from a very wealthy state, had, a lot of power and political capital within the society as it existed under Porfirio Diaz. But at the same time, there was a concern that Madero was frustrated with the lack of opportunity and autonomy that was existing as the Porfiriato grew more and more authoritarian through its time in power. And again, a lot of this in some ways is kicked off by Diaz himself giving an indication that he was interested in reducing his control and power. And so that does really in some ways allow for people to sort of out themselves as those who would like to challenge him for power. And so there is a debate among some historians about whether or not, Porfirio Diaz's interview to Creelman was sort of this, expansive opportunity for him to prove that he was this liberal reformer and it wasn't a authoritarian holding on to power, or whether it was in some ways kind of a ploy taken to convince opposition to show themselves so that he could shut it down, as he did in 1910 when Madero sort of rose against him. So as Diaz eventually, basically just kind of shrugs aside the elections, maintains himself in power, and Madero is a major threat for him. So again, we need to consider about Madero that as he's calling for revolution, he's calling for revolution for specific reasons, but he's also doing so as sort of a figurehead who doesn't have a lot of power as well, as he's fled to the United States. And so even when he calls for releases his plan of San Luis Potosi, calls for the overthrow of Madero, he's doing so from Texas. And so he ends up immediately having to tie himself to local political bosses in the North, who again have at least somewhat different reasons for joining the revolution as well. And so Northern rebel leaders Orozco and Villa, very different goals than Madero. Villa's history as a son of a hacienda worker in Durango. Orozco also had a fairly impoverished background, although he had made some money in business by the time that the revolution started as well. And so these men actually bring more support to Madero's cause than he brings along himself. Excuse me. And the revolution really comes off in some ways fairly quickly, because the power just sort of erodes around Porfirio Diaz. You have the Morelians, in the south, just south of Mexico City, rising up, causing a lot of harm down in that area and destabilizing the political situation there. And then you also have, again, just people flocking to Madero's banner throughout the North as he comes back from Texas and provides a figurehead against the, role of Porfirio Diaz overall. So rebel victory in the North, Zapata's men taking back land in the South. Diaz is essentially forced to resign just because he recognizes that his power is limited. And so with that resignation, he goes into exile, and this calls for elections to take place. And then Madero takes office, wins those elections. Again, one of the, I think quotes that we talked about a lot last year, but Diaz's quote, and I've seen people claim that it's apocryphal, that he never actually said it, and others claim that it is legitimate, was, as he was leaving, said, Madero has managed to saddle a tiger. Let's see if he can ride it, And so this idea that, he had, effectively called all of this tension and anger down on Diaz, but at the same time, was he going to be able to satiate all of the different needs and desires of the people that he had, called out to challenge Diaz in general? So again, he takes office, and the problem for Madero is interested in political reform, and he's like, we're gonna have elections. Elections are gonna fix things, and that is enough for some people in Madero's camp. Some of the people who were rebelling against him. Again, the revolution was aided by the some of the middle class and wealthy in society who felt like they had had limited opportunities for success in their own lives under Porfirio Diaz, and so those groups are like, sweet, we've accomplished our goal. Diaz is gone. Going to put Madero in power, and we'll move forward. However, as he comes to power, there's a desire for Madero to say, hey, we need to show accommodation with the regime that's leaving. I don't want to throw away all the progress that was made. I'd simply like to improve the opportunities of the opportunities for non-foreigners in society. I'd like to reduce the power of the científicos in society overall as well. And so he initially, kind of works to accommodate and appease some of the people who have been in power. He keeps a lot of the military in power. He calls on the revolutionaries to lay down their arms. And basically says, hey, we've got courts to deal with the land questions. And so, again, Zapata at this point, 1910 is the plan of San Luis Potosi. By 1911, Zapata is releasing the Plan de Ayala and calling for continued revolution. And so almost immediately, the groups that helped Madero come to power are angered with his lack of immediate action on their behalf and calling for his overthrow as well. So again, Zapata was a major, a major problem for pictures here, but Zapata was a major problem for Madero almost from the immediate moment that the war was over, because Madero wasn't interested in making the depth of revolutionary changes. And again, I've used the sort of frame of we have two groups. We have revolutionaries and we have reformers. And Madero is firmly in the reformer camp. We're going to fix the political situation, and from that point, we'll be in good shape. Zapata is a revolutionary. He wants to upset the social order and create one that he is more just and geared more towards the needs of the agrarian population of Mexico. And so when he writes the Plan de Ayala, this is a document we looked at. So again, this should be in our, we should have responses to this in our folders, and then also, responses to an assignment associated with this in our archived courses as well. So Zapata writes his Plan de Ayala, and Zapata and Orozco, who Orozco again is another of the leaders who helped Madero come to power, who's now kind of pissed because he's like, wait, I helped you get to power, and as a result of that, you asked me to lay down my arms and left the generals that I've been fighting against in charge. So he, is back in the revolution at this point, and Orozco is back in the revolution to destroy Madero because he's angry. So Orozco is, somewhat limited in terms of his loyalty to the revolution overall, and partially driven by his antipathy towards Madero from this point on. So Madero makes the choice to say, well, we're going to, I'm going to shut down this rebellion partially by naming Victoriano Huerta to the head of the federal forces. And Huerta had been a high-ranking general in the period leading up to the revolution and the overthrow of Porfirio Diaz as well. And so it's in some ways the same groups that have been in power, being left in power. And so as a result of that, Huerta has close relations with the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, Henry Lane Wilson, who is very much an acolyte of Taft and a supporter of dollar diplomacy. And so there's a desire from them to say, well, we need to get this stability back so that we can continue to effectively invest and, reap positive benefits from our investments in Mexico. And so as Huerta comes into power, is really Madero kind of leaving an opening to see himself challenged and removed from power as well, because he has empowered his enemies, and he's empowered people who are close to enemies of him as well. Orozco and Zapata, again, immediately in 1911, are back in arms against the Madero regime. So that kind of prophetic comment about he's released the tiger, let's see if he can ride it, already starts to make sense. You've gotten all these people angry and demanding change. Can you provide them with what they need? Pretty quickly, no. This leads, and really, I don't know, my notes are so goofy. Maybe it's because I blew it up too much. Let's see. No. Whatever. The other thing we need to be aware of is General, I mentioned General Huerta, and General Huerta really causes his downfall. So again, you have a situation where there is revolutionaries back in the field, but Huerta is, technically, supposedly aligned with Madero. And we need to also be aware of what is known as the Decenia Tragica, which is the 10 tragic days in which Madero is overthrown. And again, shortly after the revolution, Villa stays loyal to Madero. So, it's not as if all of these people are in lockstep with one another. Villa and Zapata will have times of a tense alliance between them, but at least at this point, Zapata, who, again, if we're talking about ideologies, Zapata is much more committed to a specific cause, in his case, land reform, whereas Villa is more of an opportunist and more looking for, benefit to himself in some ways. And that's not to say that he's, completely unprincipled or has no goals overall, or no sense of injustice, but, he's willing to, work with Madero and kind of see what will, try to, influence things from the inside as well. And then later, after Madero's death, and after, he will, also work with, or at least take deals from Obregon and other leaders to sort of protect his closest men, and also to benefit himself. Whereas Zapata really throughout until his death is committed to seeking land reform on a systemic and national scale. So Orozco is, generally hurt in the north. He does not mount a very effective charge against him, and Madero is really more or less ineffective. Zapata is angry about it. Orozco defects when he's stubbed, and then Villa ultimately also defects when he's arrested. And again, that issue is over a officer's horse. Villa is put into jail. Huerta threatens to shoot him. Madero ultimately takes Huerta's side. And again, now you have Villa, who, like Orozco, is like, I got you here. You put the people I defeated in charge of me, and now you're taking their side over me as well. So this condition leads to Madero being isolated. Madero has his federal troops that were loyal to Porfirio Diaz, and again, maybe have loyalties and friendships with other people who'd like to see the return of someone like Porfirio Diaz. And he's also alienated the people who sort of brought him to power in the form of Orozco, Villa, and Zapata. So this leads to the 10 tragic days. And at this point, you have 4 generals: Manuel Mondragon, Bernardo Reyes, who had run against Madero in 1911, and then Felix Diaz, who is Porfirio Diaz's nephew, and then Victoriano Huerta, set up a kind of fake battle, and then ultimately the troops that are supposedly loyal to Madero turn on him, and he is captured and then later executed as well. So this again was supported by Henry Lane Wilson, who was the U.S. ambassador to Mexico and was a close confidant of Taft, who wants to see the stability that existed under Diaz return so that the U.S. can continue to benefit from that stable government overall. So the 10 tragic days, betrayal of Madero by the forces of the old regime, essentially. And again, you can look at Madero and say, what are you doing leaving the nephew of your of the man you overthrew as part of your general within your military? What are you doing leaving a man that you just defeated in a contested election, in power of your military? So there's a lot of questions you might ask of him, but regardless, he is betrayed by forces who are said to be loyal to him and killed as well. And they were killed in this ley fugo, which is this fugitive law, which is basically the idea being that if someone's running away, you have a right to shoot them and kill them. And this was used to shoot people in the back and claim they've been trying to escape pretty commonly in the revolution and in the wake of the revolution as well. And so as Huerta comes back to power, Huerta becomes interim president and is like, I had no idea what's going on. I don't understand how Madero and his vice president Pino Suarez could have been killed. And so he comes back to power, or he comes to power and really in some ways is intending to chauffeur in a return of the regime of Porfirio Diaz. However, things have changed in the United States, because through this period, as Huerta seizes power, Henry Lane Wilson is a holdover from the Taft administration, but there is as Huerta changes power, or as Huerta takes power, there has been a major change in the U.S. administration with the election of Woodrow Wilson, who has a very different perspective towards Mexico overall and towards foreign policy overall, and in some ways is pretty horrified by the fact that the U.S. Has been, supporting what he sees as um, unlawful groups, and has even supported the in some way, or at least accused of supporting the coup as well. And so Wilson is pretty frustrated as Woodrow Wilson, and is frustrated with Henry Lane Wilson, and people like him, recalls him from power as well. And so you suddenly have Huerta as a president, but suddenly he doesn't have the international support. So again, the thought was this was going to be the return of this system, like the Porfirian system, but the conditions in which the Porfirian system was thriving and working with the United States have sort of ceased to exist. And so while some European countries recognize Huerta's government, the U.S. never does, and Huerta's regime becomes more and more authoritarian. He abolishes Congress. He eliminates. He holds elections, but at the same time they're not believed to be fair. This leads to the governor of Minnesota, and George Lind, being sent by Wilson to kind of find out what's going on. And ultimately what he calls for is elections without Huerta involved in them. Huerta refuses to go along with it, holds his own sham elections, and Woodrow Wilson, begins to focus on trying to find someone to oppose Huerta overall. Initially, he looks to Venustiano Carranza. And Venustiano Carranza is a very, again, quite wealthy revolutionary. He's from the state of Coahuila, and to some extent, the reason that he got involved in the revolution overall was because he felt snubbed when he was not named the governor of Coahuila by Porfirio Diaz. And so again, his grievances with the Diaz regime are very, very, very different than the grievances with the that we see in some of the other revolutionaries overall. And so Wilson recognizes that Huerta doesn't have a lot of domestic support. The foreign support that he has is limited because the United States is not involved. And so there's no real hope of this return of the Porfiriato, and we're looking for someone to support. And so this brings us to Venustiano Carranza. And again, I would encourage you all to look at those leader cards that are in our review folder and just spend some time considering who are these people, what is their background, what are their goals. And some of them it's harder to see than others. But being able to differentiate the grievances of someone like Carranza from the grievances of someone like Villa is going to be useful for you. So Carranza is the chosen supporter, or person chosen by Wilson to receive support, but he doesn't want the support. He doesn't want to be seen as as an acolyte of the U.S. government. Doesn't want to be seen as someone who is beholden to the U.S. government as well. And so Carranza really, refuses to go along with things. Wilson more or less kind of shrugs his shoulders, doesn't really recognize a government within Mexico as well. And as we'll see, each of these leaders basically release a plan at one time or another, which is sort of their plan for the revolution. And those plans are interesting as well because they really give us a key idea of what the goals of the revolution are. So looking at how does the Plan de Agua Prieta issued by Obregón differ from the Plan de Guadalupe issued by Carranza versus the Plan de Ayala or Plan de San Luis Potosi is an interesting and worthwhile thing to spend a few minutes looking at. So again, Carranza once comes into power and is a leading contender for power, challenging Huerta. And Carranza calls people to his banner by calling for a return to the Constitution of 1857. Again, if we just talked about this in our last lecture. Constitution of 1857, was kind of this liberal reform-minded document that came out of the period of almost feudal control following the independence from Spain, but was never fully implemented because shortly after it was established, Mexico was invaded by France. And then, shortly after that, you have a change of power as Benito Juarez dies, Lerdo takes over, and then you also have the Porfiriato setting in, where, again, the Constitution is more or less ignored for 34 years. So the Plan de Guadalupe, again, I mentioned that these are big problems to some extent for other revolutionaries. There's no call for social or political reforms. So some revolutionaries aren't even interested, but others kind of come to Carranza's banner for this. And one of the most important of that is Alvaro Obregon, who's one of the key Sonorans. And as we get into following the period where Carranza's in charge, we get into this period where the Sonorans have incredible power, and that leads us into the Maximado as well. So Obregon is a Sonoran, Calles is a Sonoran, and as are the other leaders of the Maximada as well. And so, as Huerta squares off against Carranza, he's pushed into the north, and that brings him into contact with Obregon and Obregon's forces. And so in that army under Obregon, we first come across Plutarco Calles as well. And so the leadership of our, leadership of a lot of the revolution is sort of starting to show up at this point. And recognition, it's a shared hatred of Huerta that brings them together. So Obregon, Zapata, Villa don't accept Huerta's claim to power, but at the same time, they're not really aligned with Carranza aside from anything or for any reason other than their anti-Huerta perspectives. And that's, again, we're basically back to a situation where instead of Diaz, you have Huerta in charge, and you have that challenge between them. So Villa wins a series of battle in the north. You can look back to, we have some maps and stuff in our folder as well, or in the slides that sort of show some of the key battles that were moving on. And so you have federal troops being forced into federal capitals out of rural areas being largely controlled by the revolutionary forces. And you have the Villa and his forces, soon to grow into the División del Norte, the largest force in the revolutionary period. And then Obregon and his Sonoran forces, really being the primary powers of this revolution to Huerta overall. The other issue that Huerta faces is the U.S. The U.S. has, concerned about German arms being delivered to Huerta, taking control of the port of Veracruz. And so to some extent, Huerta is surrounded on all sides by, Zapatistas, by Obregonistas, Villistas, and then U.S. Marines as well. And so to that point, Huerta flees into exile, August 1914, which leaves a major power vacuum as well. But as soon as this war ends, tension between the groups that have been fighting together arises. In this case, it's Obregon who takes control of Mexico City and then refuses to allow the Morelians to the south under Emiliano Zapata to enter Mexico City as well. So this, really blows up into a civil war very, very, very quickly as these different groups, kind of immediately fall to squabbling against each other as well. So Zapata received representatives from Carranza and Villa, ultimately ends up siding with Villa because he recognizes that Carranza is not interested in land reform. So Villa is, almost immediately angry with Carranza, who's not aligned with him for any reason other than their hatred for Huerta. And the fact that Obregon seems to be protecting the capital city and just assuming that Carranza is going to become the leader of the new state angers Villa and leads to significant problems there as well. Villa and Obregon at this point are also meeting together, trying to come to some accommodation. Villa sees Obregon as a lackey to Carranza, is uninterested in kind of going along with them. And so following the Battle of Zacatecas, they meet, and Villa actually attempts to have Obregon killed, which really cements Obregon's decision to work with Carranza rather than working with Villa. And an attempt to sort out what to do after this occurs at the Convention of Aguascalientes. And in this point, all of the major leaders are representatives of the major leaders are there, and they meet to discuss what should we do moving forward. There are, the moderates, primarily General Angeles, who's one of Villa's leading military strategists, and then also Obregon, who is Carranza's leading strategist, say like, look, we need to maybe we should have a situation where Villa and Carranza both renounce power, and then we can move forward as well. And so the Plan de Ayala is adopted. So they agree to land reform, things like that. But as this convention is coming along and adopting the Plan de Ayala and taking kind of radical steps overall, they say, if we're going to move forward, we have to remove some of these powerful personalities. And so Carranza and Villa are both asked to step down as the leaders of their respective positions. So Villa to give up command of the División del Norte, and Carranza to step down as the first chief of the revolution. And we need to have elections and get a government in office, or else we're going to war again. So this leads to the Carrancistas leaving the convention, and we're back into civil war. Obregon and Carranza initially are in the south, in Veracruz, and Villa and Zapata are in the capital city. But Villa and Zapata never really come up with any strategy. Neither of them want to be leader of the nation. Neither of them are particularly interested in administering Mexico City. Instead of this loose, unsigned alliance between the two of them, but there's still a lot of mistrust, as Zapata's focus is always going to be on Morelos, and Villa's is always going to be, somewhat to the north, with a little more interest in his own power as well. And so Zapata goes to Morelos, and through 1915, the Civil War really increases in intensity. And in 1915, a major battle takes place, the Battle of Celaya. Again, it's one of our IDs. And in that battle, Villa's forces are essentially destroyed. He makes some pretty poor tactical choices, is decimated by the Obregonista forces, and so another factor within this is that, at least according to Villa, Zapata has not lived up to his side of a bargain that they made to sort of help Villa in this conflict as well. But largely, Villa's refusal to abide by military advice from General Angeles and others, leads to him having significant hardship, as the weaponry of the Obregonistas is pretty effective. They are entrenched. They have entrenched positions, use barbed wire, and the Villistas are making raids at that. So in Battle of Celaya, absolutely destroyed the Villista forces, and that leads to Villa and his remaining followers kind of herring off to the hills. They try to organize support in Sonora, but are ultimately unsuccessful at conflict with Calles' forces as well. This angers Villa and creates sort of the Villa as rebel reputation that he has. And again, when we're thinking about the tests, being aware of the punitive expedition, being aware of Villa's cross-border raids to the United States, the impact that has on the United States, the role that U.S. General Pershing plays in bringing people in to look for Villa, and the anger that creates among the people of Mexico having U.S. forces in the nation is worthwhile and worth referencing as well. And again, we talked about the reasons for that. You can look back at your notes as well. But sort of the two big ones are an incident in which some of Villa's troops executed U.S. mining engineers. Again, if we're thinking about why are they angry? Well, why are mining engineers angry? Or why are they angry at mining engineers? Why is the revolution happening? Again, that's going to take us back to some of those original causes. So Carranza is elected president in 1916, and he basically tries to create a new constitution. And so he calls all these groups together, calls for them to set up a constitution, and they do so. So they effectively set up a really radical constitution. We'll look at some of the events of that. But also, as this event is taking place, as this constitutional convention is taking place, Carranza is trying to deal with Zapata. And so again, if you remember last year, we talked about this. We looked at a clip of the video. You even saw ex-Zapatistas kind of still choked with emotion talking about what had happened. but a Carnancista military official, plans to defect to the Zapatista forces, and they use a meeting between them to assassinate Zapata as well. And we'll talk about this a lot more in the post-revolutionary state. We're also starting to see the rise of labor in Mexico with the Confederación Regional de Obreros Mexicanos, or CROM, which is a key trade union in the north that we should, again, it's one of our IDs, so hopefully we get a chance to look at that and consider their importance. It will be incorporated into the government in the post-revolutionary state. And again, CROM is kind of interesting because it is it's seen as this outside labor organization, but once it's co-opted by the revolutionary state, in some ways it becomes kind of a barrier to progress, and so is then left by some of the more radical forces, who then work with people like Vicente Lombardo to establish the CTE union, which is far more radical overall. Again, this process is fairly convoluted, and so I think looking at and being sure who are the leaders, what are their backgrounds, what are their goals is useful, because again, we're going to see significant hardship between these groups as well. So Carranza comes to power with the great support of Obregón, and Obregón is quickly kind of angling towards wanting to run on his own as well. So in 1917, after Carranza ignores the Constitution of 1917, the key articles of which we'll get to in a moment, but after Carranza ignores the Constitution of 1917, Obregón resigns and is clearly planning to run against Carranza. Carranza, recognizes that Obregón's likely to beat his picked successor, and really kind of throws away and moves away from the move toward from the plans for elections in general, which causes Obregón and his military force of Sonorans, including Plutarco Elias Calles and Adolfo de la Huerta, who will be another president during the Maximato, to sort of rise up and take the capital. This pushes Carranza out. We talked about this last year, but he's assassinated after the train that he's on is stopped, and he flees on horseback and is caught and killed as well. De la Huerta takes this role as interim president, but again, it's really Obregón's job to lose at this point. And that really gets us to a point where we'll have an election under the Constitution of 1917 for the first time ever, which will be the election of Álvaro Obregón. And so we want to look at the Constitution of 1917 as well. Again, the first Constitution of Mexico is 1824. In a lot of ways, this is very limited. It doesn't really allow, or it doesn't really address a lot of key issues that existed in the society prior to independence. And so that is replaced after that revolution of La Reforma in 1857 with that more liberal constitution. Again, was never really fully implemented because of the intervention of the Porfiriato. And you get to the point after that where you have the constitutionalists. Again, the constitutionalists are the Carranza, to some extent Obregón, side of things, where they're saying we have a constitution, we just need to implement 1857. And Madero would have fallen into that group as well. And then, the Civil War is the opposition between them and the conventionalists, who led by, Villa and others, who are saying we want Zapata, and others who are saying we want a new constitution. So this convention is designed to set up a new constitution, and that's what we want to be our guiding document moving forward. So 1917 ends up being a dramatically more radical document overall. So Carranza basically is like, here's a draft, go ahead, rubber stamp this, get it back to me, we'll move forward. And they do not do that. So some of the key articles we should be aware of: land reform. So we think about the importance of land reform, and so consider, the importance of something like this. It puts conditions on foreign land ownership, says any issues are going to be decided in Mexican courts. And so 27 is the first time that there has been an effort to grant Zapata and his followers sort of what they've been calling for since the beginning of the revolution. So again, if we're thinking about that, question by, to what extent did the Constitution of 1917 address the problems of the Revolution, you should be connecting Article 27 to land reform, and at the same time thinking about Article 123 and connecting that to labor reform. So, again, workers have an opportunity to unionize. There's limits on working hours, days off per week, fair pay, workman's compensation. It says that people have to be paid in cash, not in company script. And so this is really a significant move to address those issues. Again, so again, if you're answering that question, yeah, in a lot of ways, the Articles of the Constitution of 1917 very directly address the causes of the Revolution. However, is the Constitution ever fully implemented is a different question, and worth, again, there's a question from our post-revolutionary state unit that's, by the end of the 1920s, the goals of the revolution have largely been abandoned. And again, that gives you a chance to say, well, here are the goals, here are the articles in the Constitution that address those goals, and here is Calles' failure or even lack of attempt to implement those goals as written at this point. 23 and 130, major church reform. Again, they're more harshly anti-Catholic and anti-clerical than the Ley Juarez and Ley Lerdo in the Constitution of 1857, but along those same lines. Again, so Catholic Church, the power of the Catholic Church, another cause of the Revolution, directly addressed here as well. Again, problem is that there's a lot of regional autonomy. The Catholic Church is incredibly popular throughout a lot of the nation, an overwhelmingly Catholic nation. And so it's not until Calles is in office in 1926 that they actually try to fully implement these reforms. And that leads to the Cristero Rebellion, and the cessation of church services and things in Mexico for quite some time. Article 3, education, worth looking at as well. Again, so the difference between the rural and urban populations, the fact that, again, if we're thinking about the Catholic Church, the fact that up to this point the Catholic Church had generally controlled education, another factor that helps to explain the importance of the Constitution. And then also we have some others, that are worth looking at as well. So here at the bottom, there are some other articles of note. And there's a lot of opposition as well. So again, the Carrancistas, the Catholic Church, the large landowners, there's some significant opposition to that also. So when we're thinking about, as kind of a summation, the revolution and its leaders, the things that I would really encourage you to do is spend some time looking at and considering the backgrounds and the goals of the revolutionary leaders. To get a question about, Carranza and Obregón, you need to be prepared to deal with what their goals are, their backgrounds and their, hopes for, the nation. So I would spend some time looking at the leaders, looking at those cards that we have that kind of give you background information on them. And I would also spend some time thinking about the ways in which the Constitution of 1917 directly addresses the causes of the revolution. I'm going to leave that there for now, and I will be back with a look at the post-revolutionary state.